Sound? Can you hear me all right? Good? Yeah. Ready? Okay, great. And are we going to record it?
Yes, it's all right.
Okay, great. So my name's Steven. I'm a product manager at Google, and today we'll be talking a little bit about Auth experience in consumer apps. So I've been at Google for maybe a couple years now, working on some of the APIs you might know we might use in apps that you see out there. So that's Google Sign-In, our federated offering based on Google accounts. There's Smart Lock for passwords, which is APIs to save and retrieve login information, get people signed in automatically. And we have a new one out there this year, Firebase Auth, which has replaced the Google Identity Toolkit that we've talked about at past CIS. Just basically a way to get an app or a website and a complete authentication solution off the shelf. So we'll cover some of those today. But I think really the genesis of this talk is having looked at literally probably 1,000+ apps when I check how many are installed across all my phones. Just some of the best practices, the principles that seem to work really well when building an authentication system for an app or a website. And I've seen this firsthand in the apps that we look at Google, but also just building apps and websites myself as a developer at startups. And I even used to work at Google, or used to work at Facebook a couple of years ago. I built the original Android SDK and launched it almost 6 years ago. So I've seen a few things, but you can imagine that the world that we live in today probably isn't the one that we really hope to be in. But before we get there, if you kind of go back in time, maybe almost 100 years, kind of to the Prohibition Era, and if you ever wanted a drink or something like that, you'd have to go down this dark alley and down the stairs and find the little hole in the wall that you could say your name and the secret word to get in. And that's the experience almost 100 years ago. And if we come to today, you can in fact order a drink online. You still need a username and a password, unfortunately, but it can be delivered to you, and it's a little bit more accessible. But it's probably not the experience that we're really looking for when we come to a place where we'd really like to be welcomed. We'd like to go to a place where everybody knows your name, and you can sit down at the bar. They'll know what drink you like. There's a tab open for you already. And that's really the experience that we want to give to all of our customers, to all the users, the people who visit our apps and our websites. And I think it's really what people like Ian and Lance and Robert covered yesterday, and saying how valuable it is to get to know who your user is, what their preferences are, be able to personalize the experience to them, and be able to re-engage them when they come back across devices, to not leave them out in the cold. And it's really valuable, I think, for people's businesses to be able to do this, to be able to engage and monetize, to be able to do analytics across devices, and really build an experience that helps grow your business and make it succeed. And so it's really this cheers experience that we actually like to be giving people when they come to our app or their website, but it's probably not the one that they come across every day. And there's a little bit of room for improvement, even for the professionals. If you've downloaded the CIS app yourself and had any trouble logging in, I don't think we have to go through all the different flows that you could run into, but all the time you've probably seen these apps where you try signing up only to find out that an account already exists, or you try signing in and having to recover your forgotten username or your password. And it can be really painful switching to mobile email apps and back. That's probably not the experience that we want to be giving our users and our customers. So we're at the Identity Summit, and I'll give you the silver bullet. It's federation. We're going to fix everything with federation, and I know there's probably some federation believers in the cloud. But the reality is that is probably actually not the solution that will work for everybody, because let's see what happens when you add those buttons, things like a Google or Facebook sign-in button to your app, to the first screen that users will see. Now they have actually more choice, more things to think about when it comes to figuring out how to get into this app. They have to figure out, which button it was they pressed last time, figure out what's going to happen if they pick a different button this time. They still have username and passwords. There's a lot of legacy users out there who have to figure out how to get in. They might have to reset those passwords. And all the while, there's 2 versions of this screen that all these apps are building. There's the sign-up version, the sign-in version, and people are perpetually confused over which one they should be using, and having to recover when they go between the two. And at the same time, it's actually pretty difficult for apps and websites to build this stuff themselves. there's all these problems that we'll talk about today around figuring out how to do this securely, how to link accounts when people pick different options and come back next time. And it can be really a struggle for users. And that's, I think the thing we want to try to get across here is that this is a real problem for businesses, that when we look at sign-in screens and when we do industry research, we see that nearly half of people who see one of these sign-in or sign-up screens don't actually successfully complete the action. Like, they aren't able to get into the app that they tried to. They abandon. They either give up, or they run into some kind of problem where they're not able to get into the account that they were looking for, or not able to recover their password or account information. So this is a huge problem. This is something that you should really be thinking about if you're building an app or service. It's something that basically, is an opportunity to potentially even double the number of people who are getting into your app or trying to buy or complete account registration. So, the opportunity to get twice as many people, and this is probably something that you should think about just as much as any new feature development that you're working on. So this is kind of like to boil it down into some of the things that I recommend to apps when we come across them on the internet to see what they could do to actually make things better. And we'll go through a bunch of these ideas and give some examples. And just keep in mind that it's actually pretty easy to cherry pick numbers that really illustrate these things working well. But what I often encourage apps to do is to try to measure some of these things themselves. What that drop-off rate is when they show the sign-in screen to somebody. How many people bounce when they initially install an app and open it up. And it can be pretty difficult that, like, what we often see apps do is show the user a first screen that looks like this. It just says the app's name, it says sign in, sign up. But really, if you think about what is the user's experience here, they have no idea what this app is. You've probably just paid Facebook $5 to get an effective app install out of some ad that they saw. And now they're wondering, what is this thing about? Why should I sign up? Is it worth it? What kind of information am I going to give up? And they have really no idea. So, just measure how many people see this screen and then take off, and how much money that is going down the drain. So the first thing that you could do is just move the buttons down a little bit and add something at the top that says what your app actually does. I've seen all kinds of variations of this, and there's some that are really nice native experiences that you can scroll through. Some are animations, and I think that would be interesting to measure how that performs. The next thing that you could probably do is just let people try out the app a little bit before you ask them to sign up. And I think the travel and the commerce sites that are out there do a reasonably good job of this, that you can do searches, that you can set up a bit of an itinerary or put something into your shopping cart before they say, hey, maybe you might want to sign in to be able to remember this information, to build up an itinerary that you can get across devices or complete your transaction on the next device wherever you're able to pay or something like that. So let them try it out and build up a little bit of information, preferences, something like that. And then give them a reason to sign in, to explain why it's valuable to have an account. And this example in The Guardian probably isn't the perfect one. There's probably a little bit too much text here, and the call to action with a kind of 4-button NASCAR array of options probably isn't the best. But it conveys the idea really well that there should be something in it for the user to create an account. And as the authors of apps and websites, we may think and we may realize what the value of being signed in is, but not necessarily convey that to someone who's never used this app or site before. So these, I think, are pretty common sense, basic things to keep in mind, but worth measuring and taking a look at to see how it could affect your business. Okay, so the next kind of big principle or opportunity that we've talked to a lot of apps about, and this is one that was actually the subject of Adam's CIS talk last year, which is helping people figure out the right way to get into the app. And so that's by asking basically who they are first, and then giving them some hints, giving them some suggestions that will help with these problems of remembering which button it was, what email address they should be using, or whether they should be signing in or signing up in the first place. And so let's take a look at how that kind of manifests itself in some examples. This one is Instacart, and in Instacart you can see that there is no sign in, sign up option. They basically say, let's get started, and let's start with a couple of the different ways to log in. And if you try the email option, it'll just say, hey, what's your email address? And then if you put the email address in fact, it'll do a lot of smart things about that. It'll say, hey, you've already got an account, and this is the way you should log in, or you should put in your password, or you should create a new account. And so this is one variant of sort of an identifier-first NASCAR hybrid that I think is an interesting pattern and that we've explored ourselves in things like Firebase Auth. And there's a couple of other patterns that are pretty interesting too. So this one is from the Zillow app, and in Zillow what they do is in fact ask for your email address first, even though they do offer the Google and the Facebook buttons. And then by taking that email address first, they completely steer someone to the right place. They don't even have to think about which button it was. And I think the jury is still kind of out as to whether going sort of this NASCAR of buttons first, and then doing something intelligent with the email address, or going email address first is the way to do this most effectively. And I think we'll probably in the next year take a look at some of the numbers for partner apps like Zillow and Instacart that we work with to see which is more performant. But at the end of the day, the result is something like this. It says, instead of having to think about it yourself, whether you need to sign in or sign up, it says, welcome back, we recognize you, and here's how you need to log in, and we'll help you do it. So avoiding all of this confusion about sign in, sign up, and getting people as quickly as possible to the place that they need to be to successfully authenticate. So when you kind of have gone identifier first and put somebody into the right flow, I think the next kind of big area to think about is how to make that next step as easy as possible. And so let's start with sign up. So of course everybody has to create an account at some point, and it can often be a challenge. It can also often be quite discouraging if you have to enter information multiple times. If you type in the email address once and it's right, or it was auto-filled for you, like why do you have to do it again? Do you really need all of this information at the time you're asking somebody to create an account? Can you be smart about trying to put some of this information into the forms for your user automatically? And do you really have to ask them for all of this information they probably don't like giving up just to get in the door? And that's only step one in this particular app. So the recommendation here is really, common sense again. Make it as easy as possible. Use something like an identity provider or the concept of an account chooser that I know is worked on by the OpenID Foundation. The idea being that if there's previously used information for this user or information that you can pull programmatically, do it and let them pick. Like this is the example that we use in Google's own APIs on Android. We call it a hint selector. So it's basically a list of previously used email addresses and names that you can let the user pick among. Your app is called back with this information. You can basically pre-fill most of a sign-up form, which is pretty impactful actually for sign-up conversion. We've seen a number of apps try this out in running an A/B test and see as much as 20% higher sign-up conversion, sign-up activity completion by just filling in the form with the username, email address, picture, whatnot. And then that kind of leads into the next point, which is if you get this basic information and you can fill the first steps really easily, just let that be the minimum bar. Get somebody into the door without asking for more information or masking unnecessarily for information that might not be needed right away. And so the most oftenly requested things that we see are things like social information, where for a long time we had a Google Plus sign-in option, and we found that the conversion of asking somebody to sign in with their Google Plus account, give up all of their social information at the very beginning was actually not worth the cost in terms of lower conversion, lower completion of this action, and that if you just made it very simple, you just asked for their username first, their basically email address or identifying information to create an account in the first place, that you can get more people in the door, and then later in context ask for additional information that might be relevant. So when it's time to share something, ask for social context at that point. When it's time, in this example, in the Runkeeper app, ask to connect your Google Fit account once you've actually started using the app and you see the value in providing this additional information or permissions to the app. So ask incrementally for additional authorization or information later. But if you do need to have the user fill out more information, again, make it easy. And on the web, this is an example of a mobile website for LinkedIn, being able to sign up by basically annotating forms correctly that things like email address and name will autofill. And when you are entering something like a password, you can even show it in plain text on a mobile site where someone's probably not looking over the person's shoulder to make sure they get it right the first time, and avoiding, I think, which is one of the tragedies of sign-up UI these days, which is repeated fields, especially a masked password field where you have to enter the correct password not once, but twice, and then fix it when you can't get the two to match, and then using like a show hide or something like that. So just making it easy to sign up. Very simple things that can really improve the conversion, the numbers that you see. And this last one here is an interesting one I've seen a few apps use, like Evernote, and that is to actually defer password creation at all, to say, if you can get with one tap the user's name and their email address, let them in with that, send them an email and say, hey, if you'd really like to set a password, you can do it later. So there's some interesting ideas here, and I think the jury's kind of still out on this because there is this long-term implication in terms of user experience when someone comes back and doesn't have a password. You have to be thinking through, but hopefully we'll give you an update at CIS next year as to what works well and what we've seen in some of our partner apps. But there's a lot of ideas here. Make sign up easy. So then, once you've got somebody signed up, and the other next kind of obvious one, I guess we should say, is that you should keep them signed in. So that means, it shouldn't be a pain to have to recover that account. There's a bunch of APIs that we provide on Android as Google to be able to save and retrieve login information. That's the smart lock set of APIs. But there's a lot of other interesting ideas out there. There's integration with other password managers that you can do on iOS by adding a button into the password form field that lets you trigger a password manager, by annotating your forms correctly on the web to let password managers fill in, or even some interesting ideas that William's going to talk about later this week around switching the authentication over to the web, where password managers can trigger that you can reuse session state for this device without having to have the user re-authenticate to a native app. So come check out the App Auth talk later this week. So keep users signed in automatically if possible, but if you can't do it automatically, try to take a hint. Try to get that email address first, try to get something about what their preferred account is, and then look it up. Say, this is how this person who already has an account should be signing in. You should be using Google, you should be using Facebook, you should be taking identity information provided by their preferred IDP and signing them in automatically. That's with ID tokens that our own APIs provide through UI like this. And then lastly, once they have put in that information and you steered them to the right place, keep their session up to date, refresh it. And OAuth and session management in native apps is probably a lot better than it is on the web these days, where sessions time out all the time and people have to keep logging in even if it's the same device. If you can use refresh tokens and periodically renew the access tokens that you need to be able to access backend services, definitely make use of that and don't let somebody get signed out. So that said, once you've got somebody in a state where you need to log them in and you can't do it automatically, definitely help them link to existing accounts. Again, this is pretty straightforward stuff that you want to think about an experience where you're getting the person in the door and not having them deal with the details of what their account situation is, whether they've picked a different button this time than they did last time, whether they already had an account. And it's pretty straightforward in terms of looking up whether someone, based on this identifier, already has an account and letting them know of this. But the trickier part is how to get them into that existing account securely. And if you can get a pointer from an authoritative IDP source, so that would be somebody like Google for the Gmail accounts, you should be able to just let them in with that information. But there are scenarios where you have to help somebody link an account securely. And so if you get, for example, a Facebook login, and they're not the authoritative provider of the email address you're matching against in an existing user database, you have to be able to prompt that user to re-authenticate as their original account, link the two together. But it does require some thought in the user experience, that it's not a trivial thing to explain to the user what linking accounts mean, and this can be a tricky operation to get right. But it is one that you want to do to prevent people from ending up with duplicate accounts or in some sort of confused situation, or even abandoning because they can't get into the account that they're looking for. And the last big recommendation I make in this category is that when you do use these identity providers to let somebody in, keep track of that subject claim that the things like ID tokens contain. That is really the authoritative identifier that you should use for this user when their, in fact, email address or phone number or what other identifier you may have for them could change. So this is kind of the best practices around account linking. And when you get to this point, it starts to get tricky, which really leads me into the next point here, which is that all of this stuff that we've talked about today is actually a fair bit of work to do, and it's even more work to do it correctly and securely. And so really, like, I want to segue actually into Eric from Google's talk later this week, the keynote, about leaving it to the professionals. But this is probably not something that you actually want to build yourself. To implement all the things we talked about, you get a kind of flow diagram that looks like that. We built it in Firebase Auth, and we've seen it ourselves. It was about 15,000 lines of code. So it's probably not something you want to do yourself, even if you are interested in applying the best practices and principles. And there's even worse things to this, that once you get into this situation where you're collecting usernames and passwords, you're a target. You could end up in the situation that we've seen people like LinkedIn recently, where your user database can be stolen, and it can actually ultimately harm your users across the internet, where they may be reusing passwords. And so we've seen a few apps out there, like Medium, for example, who've really moved away from passwords. This is actually a post from their site that says, passwords are obsolete now. They've basically dropped the password field in their user database, or they never collected in the first place. But it does, introduce a user experience challenge, that without passwords, how do you get people who are trying to sign in with an email address back in? What can you do to help them? And I think some of the principles we talked about earlier, like identifier first, can certainly help, and using things like ID tokens. But again, leaving it to the professionals, we'll show you in a second, there's even easier ways to do this. And here's a quote from Ian last year, you don't want to get into the business of being a toxic waste farmer with all of those passwords. And then, if you can replace passwords, like the identity provider for an authoritative identity provider for an email address is really the way to go. And in our own experience building things like the Google Identity Toolkit last year, we try to steer people whenever we can over to the authoritative identity provider for their email address. And that can be a nice way to offload the work that you'd otherwise have to do in authenticating a user. Google has hundreds of people who work on account security. We have people who are dedicated full-time to ensuring that the person who is trying to sign into a Google account is the one who's supposed to be there. So leverage that. But at the end of the day, use the opportunity here to take what's been built by the professionals, by people like Google and Microsoft, and there's others that provide an entire authentication solution off the shelf, like Auth and Firebase, and have applied all of these principles themselves and provide a backend and provide the UI to be able to do this, to be able to drop into an app in a few lines of code what would otherwise be thousands. And so that's kind of a segue into another talk that we're giving tomorrow afternoon in the Google Masterclass, which is on Firebase Auth and all of the work that went into building and designing that system. And it really is an interesting opportunity that, with about a dozen lines of code or less on each of the major platforms, you can get a full authentication system with UI, with backend, and instead of spending the engineering time of thousands of hours and lines of code in building a system yourself and making sure that it's secure, you have an opportunity here to get people in the door quickly and easily with a few lines. And so that's, I think, a huge opportunity that I would invite you to come hear more about. And just keep these principles in mind if you do have to build an auth system yourself, and send us any thoughts and feedback on what could be done to make authentication more effective in a consumer app. So with that, I think we're probably out of time today, but I can take questions afterwards, and I think we're going to have a panel next door, so you're welcome to submit your ideas and chat with us more then. Okay, should we cut it now? Thank you very much, and my pleasure.